October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. In just 6 hours, Americans lost $14 billion more than the entire Canadian economy was worth at the time. 13 million shares were sold in a frenzy of panic. Phone lines couldn't handle the volume. Communication with the stock exchange was completely cut off. But what few people know is that this historic crash began with the decision of just one man. A man the newspapers called Sunshine Charlie, America's most popular banker. This was Charles Mitchell. He was the one who triggered what we now call the Great Depression. 7 months earlier, Charles Mitchell uttered a phrase that was supposed to save the American economy. Instead, it set in motion the mechanism of the most terrible financial crash in human history. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic downturn. It was a decade-long catastrophe that rewrote the lives of an entire generation. The numbers are simply staggering. 25 million Americans lost their jobs. That's 1 in every 4 workers thrown into unemployment. 5,000 banks collapsed, taking with them the life savings of millions of families who had trusted the system. 2 million people found themselves homeless, living in cardboard boxes and makeshift tents and encampments people bitterly call Hoovervilles, named after the president who seemed powerless to stop the bleeding. The suicide rate jumped by 30%. In a country that just months earlier had considered itself the wealthiest nation on earth. People stood in endless lines waiting for free bread just to survive another day. But the crash didn't come out of nowhere. It was built, piece by piece, by decisions that seemed brilliant at the time. To understand how it all fell apart, you have to go back to the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. America was experiencing a boom unlike anything in its history. Ford automobiles rolled off assembly lines by the millions. Radios appeared in living rooms across the country. Jazz clubs lit up city streets. Skyscrapers climbed higher every year. Monuments to unlimited ambition and boundless prosperity. It felt like the party would never end. And into this euphoric moment stepped a man who would turn the dream of endless wealth into a nightmare that would haunt millions, Charles Edwin Mitchell. Born in 1877 to a modest farming family in Massachusetts, Mitchell's early life gave no hint of the influence he would one day wield. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about him, just another ambitious young man, trying to make his way in the world. But by 1919, Mitchell had risen to lead National City Bank, the largest financial institution in the United States. The bank controlled assets worth $2.7 billion, a sum larger than the entire budgets of most countries at the time. Mitchell wasn't content just running a big bank. He had a revolutionary idea, one that would transform American finance forever. Before Mitchell, the stock market was an exclusive club. Only about 500,000 Americans owned stocks, less than 1% of the population. For everyone else, investing meant putting money in a savings account or buying government bonds. Stocks were toys for the wealthy elite, traded in mahogany-paneled rooms where ordinary people were never invited. Mitchell looked at this arrangement and saw massive untapped potential. Every American should be a capitalist, he proclaimed. Why should wealth belong only to the wealthy? It sounded democratic. It sounded fair. It sounded like progress. In 1920, Mitchell created a subsidiary company called National City Company. Its purpose was elegantly simple: sell stocks to ordinary Americans, right inside bank branches across the country. When someone came in to open a savings account, they walked out with shares in America's biggest corporations. Mitchell was selling more than just financial products. He was selling the American dream itself. He turned stock selling into both a science and an art form. He studied every detail of the psychology of sales, the power of human greed, the deepest dreams of ordinary Americans trying to climb the economic ladder. His sales force wasn't a collection of boring bankers in gray suits. These were charismatic dream merchants, specially trained according to Mitchell's revolutionary program. They were deployed to 69 bank branches nationwide, each one a frontline soldier in the war to democratize wealth. The advertising campaign was groundbreaking for its era. Newspaper ads shouted seductive promises. Get rich by investing just $15 a month. Become a partner of American Telephone and Telegraph. Your children will be proud of you. You're an investor. Magazines published glossy success stories that read like fairy tales. The secretary from Ohio who became wealthy in just 2 years. The streetcar driver who bought his own house with dividend payments. Every story reinforced the same intoxicating message. This could be you. The sales techniques were carefully crafted. Psychological weapons. Salespeople would lean in close and say, "Mr. Johnson, you don't want to work for someone else your whole life, do you? General Electric stocks, this is your chance to become master of your own destiny." Or they tell a factory worker's wife, "Mrs. Smith, your husband works for Ford every day. Why don't you become a co-owner of the company he's building?" The offices of the National City Company were like temples to prosperity. Posters showed happy families in front of large suburban homes with perfect lawns. The captions read, "Thanks to stocks, we bought our dream home." Smiling faces, expensive cars, well-dressed children, every image screamed the same message. This life is within your reach. But Charles Mitchell's real genius lay in the credit scheme he popularized. Stocks could be purchased on margin, meaning you only needed to put down 10% of your own money. The bank would lend you the rest. Think about the math for a moment. You have $100 in your pocket. Under Mitchell's system, you could buy $1,000 worth of stock. If that stock increased in value by just 20%, you'd earn $100, doubling your initial investment. The salespeople made it sound foolproof. Look, Mr. Brown bought Radio Corporation stock worth $500, investing only $50 of his own money. In 6 months, the value increased by $150. His profit, 300%. Meanwhile, your money sitting in a bank account would have earned you maybe 15. The pitch was irresistible, and millions of Americans fell for it. The results went beyond Mitchell's wildest expectations. From 1925 to 1929, the total volume of loans for stock purchases exploded from $2 billion to $8.5 billion, a staggering 425% increase in just 4 years. The number of Americans who owned stocks surged from 500,000 to 10 million people. A schoolteacher from Ohio mortgaged her house to buy Radio Corporation shares. A farmer from Kansas sold his entire herd of cattle to invest in General Motors. A mechanic from Detroit gambled 6 months of salary on Ford stock. Convinced he was securing his family's future, everyone believed this was their ticket to wealth. And Mitchell basked in the glory. The press called him a financial genius, the democratizer of Wall Street. In 1928 alone, he earned $1.2 million, the equivalent of $20 million in today's money. Magazine profiles portrayed him as the man who had made every American a potential millionaire. But Mitchell wasn't finished. He pushed the system even further. He created investment trusts, basically mutual funds that used borrowed money to buy stocks. These trusts themselves became publicly traded companies, and their shares could also be purchased on margin with more borrowed money. It was a pyramid built on a pyramid, a tower of debt stacked on top of debt, all of it resting on the assumption that stock prices would rise forever. By the spring of 1929, even the most optimistic economists were starting to feel uneasy. Stock prices were climbing faster than the actual economy was growing. The gap between market valuations and real economic productivity was widening into a dangerous chasm. The Federal Reserve System sounded the alarm. The market was overheating. The numbers told a frightening story. Major company stocks were trading at prices 15 times their annual profits. For context, even today, such a ratio is considered a clear warning sign of a speculative bubble ready to burst. On February 6, 1929, the Federal Reserve issued a stern warning to banks across the country: stop issuing loans for speculation in the stock market. The central bank demanded strict limits on margin lending. The market's reaction was swift and brutal. In March, stock prices began falling. Within a few days, Americans had lost billions of dollars on paper. Fear spread through trading floors and living rooms alike. It seemed the bubble had finally burst. And then, on March 12, 1929, Charles Mitchell made a decision that would alter the course of history. He called a press conference and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. National City Bank will provide the market with all the liquidity it needs, Mitchell declared. Confidently, "We will not allow an unnecessary crisis to occur." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Newspapers across the country ran headlines proclaiming, "Sunshine Charlie saves the market." Investor confidence came roaring back. Stock prices bounced up almost instantly, within a single week. The market had recovered all its losses and surged to new record highs. Mitchell was hailed as a hero, the man who had stood up to the Federal Reserve and saved American prosperity. But what he'd actually done was pour gasoline on a fire that was already out of control. After Mitchell's dramatic intervention, the market entered its final phase of collective madness. In the summer of 1929, stock prices reached historic peaks. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed to 381 points, a record that wouldn't be surpassed for the next 25 years. 3 million new Americans rushed into the market during those final months before the crash, desperate not to miss out on the greatest wealth creation opportunity in history. Wives secretly pawned family jewelry to buy stocks without their husbands knowing. Shoeshine boys on street corners gave investment advice to their customers. Even children spent their pocket money on share certificates, playing at being investors. Those who had entered the market earlier felt like geniuses. Simple office clerks became millionaires on paper. Chauffeurs bought mansions. Secretaries walked around in expensive fur coats. The entire country was intoxicated with the illusion of endless, effortless wealth. But behind the glittering facade of prosperity, the mathematics of catastrophe were working themselves out. Every dollar invested in the stock market was backed by only 10 cents of actual money. If prices dropped by just 10%, margin investors would lose everything. If prices fell by 50%, they would owe the bank more money than they could earn in a year of work. The system Mitchell had built was a time bomb. The only question was when it would explode. By autumn of 1929, the smart money was getting very nervous. Large institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, major banks began noticing warning signs that escaped the attention of ordinary people. Caught up in the euphoria, first, fundamental economic indicators were deteriorating. Industrial production was slowing down. Automobile sales were falling. Construction of new homes was declining. But stock prices kept climbing, completely disconnected from the underlying economic reality. The gap between the stock market and the real economy had become dangerously wide. Second, sophisticated investors understood the mathematics of margin trading better than the masses. They could see that when 90% of the money in the market consisted of borrowed funds, any significant decline would trigger a catastrophic cascade of forced selling. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president, later recounted a telling anecdote. "When the shoeshine boy started giving me stock advice, I knew it was time to sell everything." Third, insiders had information about Federal Reserve plans. The central bank was preparing to raise interest rates, which would make margin loans more expensive and could trigger mass selling as people tried to get out before their borrowing costs increased. Large players began quietly taking profits. They sold in small portions, careful not to crash the market prematurely and alert the crowd to what was happening. But by October, their patience had run out. Some banks received insider information that the Bank of England was planning to raise its interest rates, which would automatically force the Federal Reserve to follow suit to prevent gold from flowing out of the United States. On the morning of October 24, 1929, New York's largest investment funds made a coordinated decision that would reshape American history. It was time to exit. They began selling in large blocks, hundreds of thousands of shares simultaneously hitting the market. Prices started crawling downward, slowly at first, then gathering momentum like an avalanche. By noon, full-blown panic had erupted. In a single day, a record 13 million shares changed hands 5 times more than normal trading volume. Brokers couldn't process the orders fast enough. The telephone system couldn't handle the massive load of calls. Communication with the stock exchange was severed. The domino effect that Mitchell had unwittingly constructed with his system of margin lending and easy credit was now in full motion, and nothing could stop it. First domino, falling prices forced banks to demand additional cash contributions from margin investors to cover their losses. Second domino, people didn't have the money to make those additional payments, they were forced to sell their stocks immediately, which pushed prices down even further. Third domino, falling prices made stocks unsuitable as collateral for new loans. Banks stopped lending money entirely, which drained the market of the liquidity it desperately needed. Fourth domino, banks that had issued too many margin loans began going bankrupt themselves. The first institutions to fall were those that had most enthusiastically followed Mitchell's example. Then came October 29th, Black Tuesday, the final devastating blow. In one single day, Americans lost $14 billion in wealth, more money than the United States had spent during the entire First World War. Behind the dry statistics lay countless human tragedies. Edward Hopkins, a mechanic from Detroit, invested his entire life savings $5,000 in Ford Motor Company stock, believing he was securing his family's future. By November, those shares were worth just $100. The bank demanded an additional $3,000 in margin payments. Hopkins walked into his garage and hanged himself. Merrick Field, a schoolteacher from Ohio, mortgaged her parents' house to buy Radio Corporation stocks during the summer boom. After the crash, when she couldn't make the mortgage payments, the bank foreclosed and repossessed the property. A family spanning 3 generations found themselves homeless, living on the street. In New York City, lines formed not only at banks where people desperately tried to withdraw their savings, but also on bridges. Suicides reached record levels. The Brooklyn Bridge became a dark symbol of national despair. People who just days earlier had considered themselves millionaires were now throwing themselves into the river below, choosing death over the shame and financial ruin they faced. The American dream had turned into a waking nightmare. What happened to Charles Mitchell, the man who had triggered this catastrophe? In 1933, he was called to testify before the United States Congress. Senator Carter Glass, one of the architects of financial reform, looked Mitchell in the eye and asked a devastating question. Do you consider yourself responsible for the ruin of millions of American families? Mitchell's reply was chilling in its coldness. I wanted to give people the opportunity to get rich, he said calmly. No one forced them to buy stocks, but justice, though slow, eventually caught up with Sunshine Charlie. In 1933, he was put on trial for evading $850,000 in federal taxes. He was forced to resign from National City Bank in complete disgrace. The man who had once been celebrated as the savior of the market became a national symbol of greed, recklessness, and moral bankruptcy. American society was deeply divided in its judgment of Mitchell. Newspapers reflected the split in public opinion. The New York Times called him the architect of financial catastrophe and the man who turned the American dream into a nightmare for an entire generation. Ordinary Americans, especially those who had lost everything, hated him with passionate intensity. On the streets of New York, he was publicly booed and cursed. One Detroit newspaper wrote with bitter anger, Charles Mitchell stole more from us than any bank robber in history. A robber takes a bag of money and runs. Mitchell took the future from an entire generation. But Mitchell also had defenders, particularly among business leaders and financial elites. Many argued that Mitchell hadn't forced anyone to buy stocks. People had made their own choices, driven by their own greed and ignoring the risks. His former colleagues claimed that Charlie had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that any banker in his position would have made the same decisions. The fate of National City Bank itself is one of history's bitter ironies. The bank not only survived the crisis, it actually came out stronger. After Mitchell's forced resignation, new management immediately shut down all the risky speculative operations and refocused the institution on conservative deposits and traditional loans. The bank received substantial government support under the doctrine of being too big to fail. The collapse of smaller competitor banks allowed National City to acquire their assets for pennies on the dollar. By 1935, National City Bank controlled an even larger segment of the American financial market than it had before the crash that it had helped cause. Mitchell himself spent the remainder of his life in relative obscurity. After his trial and disgrace, he moved to Europe. where he worked as a consultant for small European banks. He returned to the United States in the 1940s and founded a modest investment company. But he was a shadow of his former self, Sunshine Charlie, the man who had once been celebrated as a financial genius and featured on magazine covers, had become an elderly cautionary tale remembered only as a symbol of the greed and recklessness of the 1920s. Mitchell died in 1955 at the age of 78, never once publicly acknowledging his responsibility for triggering the Great Depression, the catastrophe that Mitchell had helped unleash changed the American financial system forever. In 1933, Congress passed the landmark Glass-Steagall Act, which forcibly separated commercial banking from investment banking. The goal was brutally simple: never again allow bankers to gamble recklessly with ordinary depositors' money. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to provide strict oversight of financial markets. Federal bank deposit insurance was created to protect people's savings. Stringent new requirements for margin trading were implemented and enforced. America swore, with the passion of the recently traumatized, that this catastrophe would never happen again. But the government took even more radical measures. In April 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that fundamentally shocked the American economy. Private individuals were now prohibited from owning gold. All Americans were legally required to surrender their gold coins and gold bars to the federal government at a fixed price. Refusal was a federal crime. This was a desperate attempt to regain control over the monetary system. As long as people could demand gold for paper dollars, the government couldn't freely print money to fight the devastating deflation that was strangling the economy. In just 1 month, Americans surrendered more than 3,600 tons of gold to the federal government, a quantity larger than the current combined gold reserves of Russia and China today. Then, a year later, the government raised the official price of gold from $20 per ounce to $35 per ounce, effectively earning billions of dollars in profit from the gold it had confiscated from its own citizens. The scars left by the Great Depression remain visible for generations. The American economy took a full 10 years to recover to its pre-crash levels. Millions of people forever lost their faith in the stock market as a safe place to build wealth. An entire generation preferred to keep their money hidden under mattresses or in coffee cans buried in backyards rather than trust it to banks or brokers. The psychological trauma ran deep and lasted decades. Today, almost a century after Black Thursday, history is repeating itself with frightening accuracy. 50 million Americans now trade stocks through smartphone applications. The total volume of margin loans has reached a record-breaking $900 billion higher than ever before in absolute terms. Apps like Robinhood promise exactly what Mitchell promised 100 years ago. Make everyone an investor. Zero commissions. Trade like a professional. Invest your entire paycheck. With one tap, a new generation is pouring money into cryptocurrencies and meme stocks, borrowing on margin accounts, absolutely convinced that this time is fundamentally different. The average American today carries debt that exceeds their annual income. Margin trading as a percentage of market capitalization has reached 1929 levels. And once again, millions of people believe with absolute certainty that the music will never stop playing. Charles Mitchell's story is not simply a tale of villainy or evil intent. It's a story about how genuinely good intentions can lead directly to catastrophe. Mitchell really did want to give ordinary people a chance to participate in wealth creation and build better lives. He believed he was democratizing finance and spreading prosperity. But the system he created and perfected transformed the American dream into a devastating nightmare. For a quarter of the nation's population, every American should be a capitalist, Mitchell proclaimed confidently in 1928. Everyone should invest, today's financial influencers and app developers say with equal confidence. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but as Mark Twain supposedly said, it often rhymes with disturbing precision. The next time you hear seductive promises of easy money and passionate calls to democratize finance and make everyone an investor, remember the story of Sunshine Charlie and ask yourself the most important question: Who is really going to profit from this system? Is it you or is it the people selling you the dream? The Great Depression wasn't an accident of nature or an unforeseeable catastrophe. It was the predictable, mathematical result of a financial system built on borrowed dreams, easy credit, and unchecked greed. Charles Mitchell didn't create that system entirely by himself, but he perfected it, marketed it brilliantly, and sold it to millions of trusting Americans who believed in him. Subscribe to the channel. There will be many more stories like this ahead, stories about the hidden machinery of money and power, and the people who pull the levers while the rest of us pay the price.